Well, it's good to see you all this morning. I know some of you were out late last night on 6th Street, so seeing some friendly faces bright and early in the morning is always great. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm not the kind of guy who typically gives speeches from a podium. I also know it's not really like the way you do it at South by. But my task here this morning is a little different than I've done in the past, which is to set up a discussion about where the internet is going by first providing a short history lesson on how we got here. And since it's not a talk I've given before, and I want to be sure I tell the story properly, I decided it'd be best to use notes. So you can kind of think of this as like Professor Case giving his first lecture on internet history or something like that. But let's get started. It's really incredible to look back at that PBS interview, however embarrassing it might be, and think about how much has happened in the past couple decades. And the pace of change, I think you all know, is really now accelerating. Looking ahead, I think back to what Yogi Berra famously said, "It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future." And so much of what entrepreneurship requires is exactly that. Seeing into the future, kind of peeking around the corners, focusing not on where the puck is, but where the puck is going. I spent a lot of my time trying to understand what that future might look like. And I've come to the conclusion that one way to understand the future is to look back and learn a little bit from the past. In particular, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, a number of trends that were significant during the early days of the internet are re-emerging in today's ubiquitous Internet of Things economy. Back then, to succeed, we needed to embrace the critical role of strategic partnerships and recognize the role government plays in setting the stage for innovation to flourish. And my sense is the next wave of great companies will once again need to embrace policy and also partnerships. So I'd like to spend a few minutes sharing more about my experience and explaining how the internet got to this point before diving into a conversation about where this all might be going. 35 years ago, back in 1980, which I know is before many of you were my application to business school. In it, I talked about how technological advances in communications were on the verge of altering our way of life. I talked about innovations that would make our television sets into an information lifeline. I was predicting the future as best I could see it. Well, every business school I applied to rejected me. So I ended up taking a different route, a marketing job at Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then a couple years later, I moved to Wichita, Kansas to join Pizza Hut, where I was, I kid you not, the director of pizza development. Yes, it's true. My job was to travel from city to city, eating pizza, trying to come up with new ideas. And because I was out on the road so much, I spent a lot of time on my new K-Pro portable computer. To be honest, calling it portable was something of an exaggeration. That K-Pro computer actually weighed 30 pounds, which is about 10 times more than most of today's laptops. After I bought the K-Pro, I had to then buy a modem and figure out how to plug it in. Then I had to buy a subscription to services like CompuServe and The Source, so I had something to connect to. This was 1982. Remember, this was a time when tinkering on a computer was generally viewed as a hobby. Very few people had PCs, and of those who did, very few had the modems they needed to turn those PCs into connected devices. It was complicated, and it was expensive to get online. Believe it or not, back then it cost $10 per hour to be connected. But I was hooked. And I believed that interactive services would someday change the world. So I decided to give up pizza for protocols. And I drove from Kansas to Washington, D.C., and got started building what would eventually become AOL. You may be surprised to learn that AOL wasn't the first product we tried. We started with something called GameLine, which was sort of like Netflix for video games in the dial-up era. It didn't work. But we didn't give up. We just shifted the focus. Next, we tried what we were calling private label online services. In essence, we were making custom online services for PC manufacturers like Commodore and Radio Shack and IBM and Apple. That got us going, but then we hit a wall. Apple had agreed to license their brand name to us to create a service called Apple Link. But not long after we launched, Apple had a change of heart and decided they didn't like the idea of an independent company offering Apple-branded services. But again, we didn't give up. Once again, we pivoted. Apple paid us a couple $1 million to break the contract. We couldn't use the name Apple Inc. anymore, so we had to come up with a new one, and we had an internal naming contest. We decided to relaunch as America Online. We chose America Online because it defined our mission to get the country online. America Online went public in 1992, the same year Congress decided to permit commercial use of the internet. So let me pause there for a second. Think about it. It was actually illegal for most people to connect to the internet before 1992. At the time, most believed access to the internet should be limited to programmers and scientists and educators. But we believed everybody should be allowed to get online, and we also believed passionately that someday everybody would want to get online. The journey to build the internet and make it part of everyday life was a wild ride. There were lots of ups and lots of downs. I think back about those early days, the period from 1985 to 2000, as the first wave of the internet. That first wave was about building the internet and spreading the word. In those early days, companies like Cisco, WorldCom, IBM, Microsoft, Netscape, and yes, AOL, were creating the core technologies for widespread connectivity, the on-ramps to the information superhighway. What sounds obvious now was not obvious to most back then. It actually took us several years to convince PC manufacturers to build modems into PCs. They didn't want to bother because most people didn't seem to want or need to be connected. Most media companies didn't want to bother to create digital content because they doubted the market would ever be big enough to bother. And most retailers didn't believe in the idea of e-commerce. Indeed, they couldn't even imagine that consumers would ever trust this newfangled internet enough to actually enter their credit card information online. Back then, the doubters were many and the believers were few. But we kept innovating, creating services that might attract a mainstream audience. Some at the time believed content would be key. Others believed in commerce. We believed in community. At AOL, we always thought the killer app was people. While we offered a wide range of services in conjunction with a wide range of partners, our principal focus and passion was on creating ways for people to connect with each other. We launched chat rooms, what we called People Connection, and created services like instant messaging and buddy lists. The idea of community, what we now call social media, of course seems obvious today, but it was anything but obvious in the first wave of the internet. We had to run commercials on television to explain what this new online world was all about. So let's have some fun on this throwback Saturday and watch a TV commercial we ran 20 years ago.
Every day, America Online is making it easier for people to live, work, and play.
Hey, Dan, ready for the game? I'm just finishing up here with my new kayaking friends.
Kayaking friends on your computer?
Yeah, I just got America Online.
Sounds great. Listen, I can't go to the game today.
What?
I've got to send something for my mom's birthday. It's tomorrow. I'll then book plane tickets for our trip next week, and my kids got to go to the library to look up dinosaurs.
Hey, we can take care of all that before we go.
Yeah, right.
Oh, with America Online.
America Online can do all that?
Yeah. How about sending your mom some nice flowers? All you do is click on Marketplace. We place an order.
Call now for America Online, a new way to use your computer to communicate, have fun, and get instant news and information.
Flowers are sent. Now let's access the online travel service.
How long have you had this?
About a week. And it's so easy. All you do is point and click.
But how does it work?
All you need is a computer and a regular phone line. They send you the software and give you 10 free hours to check it out.
Call now for your free America Online Startup Kit and get free software and 10 free online hours. It's everything you need to get online.
Plane tickets are ordered. Now, let's look up dinosaurs. What do you think? Compton's Encyclopedia or National Geographic?
You get all that with America Online?
Yeah, you can read Business Week online before it hits the newsstand.
Update your stock portfolio every 15 minutes with PC Quote. You can even play fantasy football.
Call now for 10 free hours of America Online and get instant access to the worlds of sports, finance, computing, and entertainment.
Here come the dinosaurs. I saved you a trip to the library.
That's great.
Yeah, downloading is easy too. You know, I can even send email on the internet. And of course, there's my personal favorite, live chat. That's how I met my new kayaking buddies. We'll check that out later, after the game.
So how do you get America Online?
Oh, well, that's easy too. You just call their 800 number.
I gotta check this out.
Call 1-800-614-3434 now for your free America Online Startup Kit with free software and 10 free online hours. It's everything you need to get online. So call 1-800-614-3434.
So did you all get that 800 number down in fast enough time? That's pretty amusing. Yes, AOL could do all that, including addressing the challenge a lot of people apparently had back then, which was connecting with their kayaking buddies. But we kept spreading the word, and we distributed a whole lot of those discs and CDs, and eventually people got online. In 1996, AOL had 5 million customers, and it started to become an indispensable part of people's lives. In fact, when our systems went down for a day that year and people couldn't get online, it caused a national panic. And the momentum kept building. By 1999, we were up to 20 million subscribers. But back then, we still had to run ads to explain to people why they needed the internet. And here's one we ran 15 years ago.
Online 4.0, the easiest just got easier.
It's easy to install and easy to get started.
Everyone I know is on it. Email,
instant messages. There's no better way to keep in touch.
You've got mail.
They made the internet easier than ever.
Free 24-hour customer service.
We've spent over $1 billion to create the world's largest high-speed network. Now with 56K, connections are faster than ever.
It's fast.
If you have a phone line, you can go online.
What will they think of next?
America Online, so easy to use, no wonder it's #1.
So that was the first wave of the internet. It involved building the networks and services to enable people to get online, establishing the partnerships to create compelling services, and evangelizing the benefits of the internet. That first wave peaked around 2000. That set off the second wave of the internet, which has evolved over the past 15 years. Because the internet was now built and its use was increasingly pervasive, the focus of entrepreneurs shifted away from building the internet and towards building on top of the internet. Search engines like Google made it easier to explore the growing volume of information online. Social platforms like Facebook emerged to strengthen the connections between people. Video platforms like YouTube shook up our conceptions of content. Services like Twitter emerged to extend the reach of a global community. And when Apple and others turned our phones into tiny computers always connected to the internet, we saw the launch of the app economy. The second wave has been a time of great innovation. Small teams have been able to have a big impact. Apps that have been able to break through and get noticed have been able to achieve tremendous traction, sometimes virtually overnight. The second wave of the internet, building apps and services on top of the internet, will continue. Many of you are working on the next generation of second wave startups. And I've seen a lot of great entrepreneurs building great products that can have great impact. But now I think we're at a pivotal point in the internet's history. We've witnessed the impact of the first wave, which built the internet and made it relevant. We've seen how the second wave has built on top of the internet and transformed our lives again by putting the internet in our pockets. Now, I think we're on the cusp of the third wave of the internet, which will be about integrating the internet even more seamlessly and more pervasively into our everyday lives. And this third wave will be driven by an accelerating rate of disruption. It took AOL almost 10 years to reach 1 million users. By contrast, it took Facebook just 10 months. And more recently, apps like Snapchat have reached 1 million users in less than 10 weeks. But of course, rapid change leads to rapid disruption. That means early pioneers, including AOL, can quickly lose their lead and then struggle to reinvent themselves. It's a classic example of what happens to large incumbents who shift from playing offense and constantly innovating to playing defense and trying to protect the status quo. And this battle between the attackers and the defenders is going to heat up in this third wave. The pace of change and the threat of disruption creates tremendous opportunities for the next generation of entrepreneurs if they understand the battle ahead. The first wave disrupted the communications industry. The second wave had broader impact as it disrupted media and commerce. The third wave will disrupt the rest of the economy and some of the biggest industries in the country, like healthcare, education, transportation, energy, and food. Indeed, the sectors ripe for disruption by third wave companies account for more than half of our economy. The third wave entrepreneurs that set out on the path of disrupting those industries will be building some of the most important companies of the next 15 years. You'll hear a lot this week in Austin about the technology trends driving this next wave of innovation, like drones and wearables, the Internet of Things, and big data. Those tech trends are important, but there are 4 other mega trends that are also shaping the future that you likely won't hear so much about this week. So I'm going to touch on each of them now, and then we'll delve into them more in the discussion that follows. The first is easier access to capital to start companies. In the first wave, it was hard to raise startup capital. In the second wave, it got a little easier because of the growth of angel investors. And in the third wave, I'm optimistic the concept of crowdfunding will make it even easier and level the playing field for entrepreneurs who have startup ideas and for people who want to invest in startups. And I'm pleased to report that the city where I live, Washington, D.C., actually did something to help entrepreneurs nearly 3 years ago when Republicans and Democrats came together to pass the Jobs Act, which stands for the Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act. The Jobs Act legalized the use of the internet to raise startup capital. For more than 80 years before the Jobs Act, startups were banned from talking about raising money, and most people were banned from investing in startups. But that is starting to change. We've already seen the power of crowdfunding play out when it comes to launching a product or kickstarting a project in the arts. We're beginning to see crowdfunding platforms like AngelList and Circle Up emerge to serve the needs of wealthy accredited investors. And soon, the SEC will finalize the rules to allow a new class of investors to back a wide range of entrepreneurs via crowdfunding. And that should help unleash a new wave of startup activity all over the country. The second big trend in the internet's third wave will be the re-emergence of strategic partnerships. When people ask me about the keys to AOL's success, I often cite an African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you must go together. The role of partnerships was critical in the first wave of the internet. Most of the successful companies in the second wave of the internet focused on product, so they typically didn't need partnerships to get going. They were able to build on top of the internet and thus were often able to go it alone. But in the third wave, I believe partnerships will once again matter. The big successes won't go it alone, they will go together. The entrepreneurs who are really striving to reinvent education cannot just ignore teachers and schools. And those who want to truly revolutionize healthcare will need to engage with doctors and hospitals. These partnerships can accelerate growth and maximize impact. In the second wave, the people you hired were a critical success factor. Indeed, it has been said that the team you build is the company you build. People will, of course, continue to be important in the third wave, but with an added twist. Who you partner with may turn out to be just as important as who you hire, and the network you build around your company may be just as important as the work you do within your company. And successful third wave companies won't just focus on business partnerships. They will also increasingly seek partnerships with governments. Now stay with me here. I know many of you, indeed probably most of you, don't want to have to deal with governments, as governments tend to move slowly and create bureaucratic roadblocks that often slow innovation and frustrate entrepreneurs. But it's important to note that the government played a crucial role in unleashing the first wave of the internet. It was the government investment in a defense agency called ARPA that led to what became the internet. Later, it was judicial decisions such as the ruling in D.C. by Judge Crean to break up the AT&T that unleashed tremendous innovation in the telecom sector. And Congress acted in the 1990s to open up the internet for everyday use, and then put a light touch regulatory regime in place to help the internet take off. So in many ways, the first wave of the internet was made possible by the government. In the second wave, the government role faded. But as the third wave breaks, government will become important again. We've seen that recently with a debate about net neutrality. But like it or not, you ain't seen nothing yet. As entrepreneurs seek to disrupt industries like healthcare and education, they will need to recognize the role governments play, and not just as regulators, but also as customers. The government spends more on health and learning than anybody else by far. So successful third wave entrepreneurs will need to engage more not only with governments as their principal regulator, but also as their potentially largest customer. Engagement with governments may sound unappealing to many of you, but the entrepreneurs who figure out how to operate in this new framework have the potential to reap amazing rewards in this next wave. The third big trend of the third wave will be in the area of social enterprises, or what many call impact investing. Many of the successful companies in the third wave will not be solely focused on profits. A lot of them will also be focused on purpose. The conventional wisdom in business is companies should care only about profits. Indeed, one of our nation's most respected economists, Milton Friedman, has said it point blank: the social responsibility of business is to increase profits, period. But that notion is beginning to get second-guessed by a new generation of entrepreneurs. And you need to look no further than the Fast Company's list of the 50 most innovative companies. This year's list included Revolution Foods and Warby Parker, two companies that have embraced the idea of being a benefit corporation. And there are many other companies putting impact at the center of what they do. In fact, there are now more than 1,200 certified B Corps. They have all committed to formally report on the financial and social impact of their companies. This isn't just a fad. These are real companies with names you recognize. From Patagonia to Etsy and Tom's to Tesla, we're going to see more companies bring together profit and purpose. And last but not least is the fourth trend of the third wave, which is that entrepreneurship is going regional and going global. As you all know, Silicon Valley has been at the epicenter of the second wave of the internet. And Silicon Valley will continue to be the pride of America and the envy of the world. But the third wave will wash over the entire country, creating new hubs of innovation. We're starting to see what I call the rise of the rest. I've hit the road on our Rise of the Rest bus to see firsthand how innovation and entrepreneurship is exploding all across the country. Last year I visited Detroit, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and Nashville in the spring, and then Madison, Minneapolis, Des Moines, Kansas City, and St. Louis in the fall. And today I'm pleased to announce that we'll be firing up the Rise of the Bus again in May for our first trip through the South. We will be visiting Richmond, Raleigh-Durham, Charleston, Atlanta, and New Orleans. These are all great American cities with great legacies, but also great futures. These cities are well positioned to benefit from, and in some cases drive, the third wave of the internet. As partnerships become more important, cities in the middle of the country, which is where most of the Fortune 500 companies are based, will become more important. And crowdfunding will give more of the entrepreneurs in these rise of the rest cities the initial capital they need to get started. And it's worth noting that the rest isn't just rising in the middle of America, it's also rising all around the world. We're now seeing the globalization of entrepreneurship. And startups are now alive and well all across the globe, creating innovative products and services, and also creating more hope and opportunity in places like the Middle East and Africa. Indeed, an organization I chair, Startup Weekend, hosted 5 events this week in, of all places, Tehran, Iran. These Startup Weekend events brought 500 Iranians together who believe the path forward for the region needs to be centered around entrepreneurs. The lesson here is clear. Entrepreneurship is not just about building products and making money. It's also about lifting up communities and making a difference. So that's my take on the past 30 years, sort of how we got to now. And when I think about where we've been and how far we've come, I believe there isn't a better time to be an entrepreneur than right now. As we move into the third wave, we can improve learning by making it more personalized. We can improve health by making it more customized. We can save energy by monitoring it and storing it better. And there are many other important aspects of our lives that we can improve, and significant sectors of our economy that we can disrupt. And the people that are going to do that are the entrepreneurs, people like you in this room, people who really believe we can make the world a better place, people who believe partnerships can maximize impact, people who believe in purpose as well as profits, people who believe the playing field should be leveled for entrepreneurs and capital, so everybody, no matter where they live or who they are, has a shot at the American dream. So thanks for sitting through this history lesson. Hopefully you now have a little better understanding of where we came from and also where we're going. I tried to deal with some of these topics in sort of a broad brush kind of way, but there's obviously more to discuss. So please join me in welcoming Catherine back to the stage so we can continue the conversation.
Thanks, Steve. Hopefully my mic is working now.
Yeah, it's working perfect.
Excellent, excellent. So thank you very much for that. You are obviously very optimistic about entrepreneurship, trends we've seen so far, and where we're going. If you look at the data, though, business formation rates have been declining pretty steadily over the last 30 years. So if it's not access to capital, which is usually an argument I hear for why entrepreneurs are having a harder time today or not as common today as in the past, what are the big obstacles?
Well, I think there are a lot of them, and I would say that there are, in some ways, 2 Americas. There are some places like Silicon Valley, but also New York and Boston, and increasingly, Austin and some other places, where there is a fair amount of capital to get started. But most of the country doesn't have the angel networks to get going, which is why I think crowdfunding can be so important. So capital is a key. There are a lot of people with great ideas who don't have access to capital. Mark Zuckerberg happened to be at Harvard and happened to have a rich friend across the hall, and that got Facebook going. But not everybody goes to Harvard, and not everybody has a rich friend. And how do you give them a shot? And creating more access to capital through things like crowdfunding is helpful. So capital is important. Talent is very important. And as I said, there are great cities in this country that are strong beacons of innovation around particular sectors. Agriculture, for example, Louisville and St. Louis, they're great. Monsanto, one of the leading agriculture companies, is based in St. Louis. In healthcare, there's a lot of innovation in Nashville and in cities like that. In DC, where I am, there's lots of innovation around companies trying to do things that have some connection with the government, either some of the technology happening or some of the, the regulatory issues. As we continue to build up those talent bases, there will be a flourishing kind of entrepreneurial economy in those places, and those places will then start seeing a boomerang effect where people will want to come back to those cities if they're born there or went to school there because they have the sense of opportunity. So talent's a big deal. Culture is a big deal as well. That each of these communities is a little bit different, but some of them do tend to be a little risk averse, and we have to figure out ways to be more welcoming and supportive and encouraging of entrepreneurs. Regulations matter, and in different states, different cities have different approaches to regulation. So there are a variety of different factors. Indeed, there's an organization, I mentioned Startup Weekend, the parent organization is called Up Global, and that's what I chair, and we published a report a few months ago that if you search on Up Global Thriving Startup Communities, you'll see kind of the key factors that drive this. What we need to do is build up more of these regions so that there's a broader innovation economy. Last year, 75% of venture capital went to 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. And the other 47 states fought over the other 25%. But if you look at our Fortune 500 companies, as I mentioned earlier, 75% of those are in those 47 states. So we just need to kind of change the dynamics here and not just focus on a few sectors and a few places, but have a broader kind of innovation economy.
So you mentioned risk aversion just now, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot. Several years ago, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, one of the selling points that I often heard was that it would make it easier to take risk because once you decoupled health insurance from your employer, that would make it, give people maybe less of a downside if they wanted to start their own company. I'm just curious if you have seen any link between the availability of health insurance and people's willingness to go it alone and start a new company. Are there other ways in which we might think about revamping the social safety net so that if people do want to start their own companies, they might have more of a net to fall back on? I mean, I'm thinking about other things like unemployment insurance, which you don't have access to if you're self-employed, right, for example.
No, I do think the Affordable Care Act is complicated and different people have different views of it, but it's pretty hard to argue that it hasn't been helpful to startups because this issue of portability was a big deal. It's not the only reason people stay in big companies. There are a lot of, particularly in some of these heartland cities, that people tend to be loyal to the companies, which is a healthy thing, but also tend to be risk averse about doing something that seems kind of crazy and risky, which is what most startups are. But the fact that if they left that company, they'd not only be taking the risk on that startup, but putting their family at risk in terms of healthcare was a factor. And so it has resulted in more people. And I don't think there's any magic bullet here. I think what you'll see is the different factors I talked about, things like crowdfunding and things like some of these bigger companies trying to figure out ways to partner with smaller companies and just trying to attract more talent to different cities or get people to come back. You kind of hit a tipping point, and Austin's a good example of this. It was sort of not a big startup town 20 years ago. Now it's flourishing because it just has a variety of things kind of came together that created that kind of network density, and that's what we need to do in other places around the country. Saw the same thing in Washington, D.C. When we started AOL there 30 years ago, it was a government town. We had to go to New York and Boston and Toronto to get our venture capital. None of it came from D.C. There were no venture firms in D.C. 30 years ago. And even our lawyer was from Boston because most of the law firms were used to dealing with the government, not used to dealing with startups. That's changed. D.C. is now one of a thriving startup kind of region. So it takes some time, but it's not any one thing. It's how everybody kind of works together and drives more collaboration and more collisions and more of that network density.
It sort of feels like the discussion about regulatory barriers and regulatory hurdles for startups primarily occurs on the federal level. But from my own conversations with people who run small businesses, which may or may not be representative, you've talked to many more, many of the hurdles are at the state and local level. Registering your business, occupational licensing, getting the proper insurance and all of that sort of thing. Has there been much movement towards deregulation at the state and local level?
I think it's true. There are a lot of things at the federal level. There's a lot more at the kind of the local level. I think it requires 65 or 70 different permits or things you do in DC to open a restaurant, for example.
Right.
So
Yeah.
and that's too much, and it needs to be simplified. And I think technology will enable some of that simplification. And there are some governors and some mayors who are pushing this forward, trying to use kind of have government be more of a platform and use technology to manage services in a way that's much more flexible and convenient. And also some of the things that were put in place as regulations, in fact, almost all of the things that were put in place as regulations were to solve a problem that existed in the market. And people said, well, we don't want that to happen again, so we need this regulation. Some of those regulations now, 10, 25, 50, 100 years later, don't make sense. Indeed, some of the new technologies allow you to create more of transparency around different companies and products and services is a way to kind of reduce some of that. But there'll always be some level of regulation. I mentioned in this third wave, I think sectors like healthcare are always going to have some degree of regulation. People want to have somebody checking out restaurants to make sure the food's safe and their kids don't kind of get sick. People, we complain about regulation at one level, certainly as entrepreneurs, because it does feel like it's constraining and slowing us down, but in most cases we like some of the things that are in place as it relates to kind of our families and our community. We like the fact that essentially the government subsidizes education for most people, and that creates a little more of an opportunity for giving people more of a shot. We like the fact that the government subsidizes healthcare, so we focus on our co-pays, and if we have a $50,000 surgery, we don't have to actually pay $50,000. So there's sort of these two sides of this, and I don't think regulation is going to go away. I certainly don't think government's going to go away. I think what right now exists with entrepreneurs over here and the government over there needs to become more of a dialogue, more of a conversation, and figure out which regulations shouldn't be there, which regulations should be changed, and also how to have a more constructive partnership between business and government, particularly between startups and government.
So you've been doing this bus tour around the country, looking at lots of different cities that are trying to get more of a hotbed of entrepreneurship. And certainly there are tons of mayors around the country who say that they are going to be the next Silicon Valley. Everybody's the next Silicon Valley. But it's not really clear what it takes to maybe not to become, I think Silicon Valley is probably unique in history, but to become a hotbed of startup activity. I'm curious if you have actually seen smart, innovative policies that have been successful at the local level beyond sort of the standard toolkit of just cutting taxes.
Yeah, I think the more governors are recognizing that the battle that's been fought for the last 25 years around economic development, which is basically, I'm going to bribe you, Mr. Fortune 500 company, to move your manufacturing plant or move your headquarters here, and basically, that state loses it, this state gets it, but it actually doesn't have, there's no net benefit to the country, is kind of a losing battle. And that will continue. There will be some of those dynamics, but I think more people are recognizing that the seed corn is the startups, and many of those startups will fail, but some will succeed. And if you want to have a thriving community, a strong economy 20 years from now, you've got to invest in the startups.
But are there specific policies that you have seen these
and
places
so
undertake?
Some are putting more investment capital in place, trying to attract more talent, trying to create some different incentives to get partnerships with different companies. And in the 9 cities we visited, there's some things that are similar in terms of what's happening, but each of them was a little bit different. For example, in Cincinnati, there was a strong partnership with some of the Fortune 500 companies like P&G that did recognize exactly this point, that if they're just focusing on their business, they're going to have a problem. They need to figure out ways to network around their business and support this next generation of companies. Pittsburgh, the university, Carnegie Mellon in particular, plays a big role. They're really strong in making things. They were kind of powered the whole steel kind of industrial revolution. They're big in robotic technology, things like that. Detroit, the role of government's a bigger deal because basically Detroit went bankrupt, and so the role the mayor and the governor plays there in getting it back on track is more important. By the way, you said that Silicon Valley is sort of this kind of a historical anomaly. If you look at the history of America, we've actually had a bunch of Silicon Valleys, and Detroit and Pittsburgh, I think, are illustrative of this. If 60 years ago, Detroit was Silicon Valley. Detroit was the hottest entrepreneurial region in the country, arguably the world, when the car was the hot technology of the moment. Back then, Silicon Valley was like apple orchards. Detroit was it. 100 years ago, 125 years ago, Pittsburgh was Silicon Valley. It did power the Industrial Revolution. It was the center of gravity for the nation and the economy at that particular juncture. 200 years ago, it was agriculture in the middle of the country. 1.98% of jobs in America were in agriculture. And the big companies, the big players were in the middle of the country, cities like St. Louis and Louisville. So the arc of American history is, you can't separate the importance of entrepreneurs first leading the way with this agricultural revolution, then the Industrial Revolution, more recently the information digital technology revolution, and it's happened in different regions of the country. And as I said, I'm very bullish on Silicon Valley, so this is not a kind of anti-Silicon Valley thing. It's more a pro-rise of the rest thing, and a belief that some of these cities that really were very, very important innovation hubs 50 years ago or 100 years ago are going to become very important again in this next wave, because the sectors that are going to be disrupted are playing to their strengths.
Just to switch gears slightly for a second, in listening to your talk about the history of AOL, about the first, second, and third waves of the internet, I was thinking a little bit about how we're seeing some phenomena that are similar to things that earlier generations of entrepreneurs went through. And in particular, something that's been getting a lot of press recently is about bad behavior on the internet. Right. And this is something that AOL dealt with once upon a time, right, back when people were going online not just to find their kayaking buddies, but sometimes to prey on children or to do other illegal activities. And now we're sort of seeing a similar shade of this today that's maybe not as focused as much on adults going after children, but online harassment, abuse, doxing, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering what your experience with customers behaving badly online, when you were running AOL, can teach us about the role and responsibility for companies today for kind of policing the behavior of their users, either from a legal or an ethical standpoint.
No, I think it's important. I think companies that have a big impact have a big responsibility, and when you start small, as AOL did or many other companies did, you're kind of focused on obviously just your business and trying to stay alive and figure out some product that will get some traction. But as you get more successful, what comes with that are a set of responsibilities. In our case, particularly in the 1990s when the internet was coming of age, we were very concerned about making sure it was safe for kids. We were very concerned about the digital divide. We put a lot of effort into initiatives trying to deal with some of these different problems, and had big teams of people trying to deal with these different problems. And the basic view was, internet is wonderful, it does great things, we wanted everybody to get connected, we're super enthusiastic and passionate, almost evangelical about the possibilities of the internet, but we also can't ignore the fact that there is a darker side, there is a downside of these things. So how do we maximize the upside and minimize the downside? It required a concerted effort, both within the company, with the networks we built around the company, and also in that case with governments. We did a lot of work in the 1990s, the time Bill Clinton was the president, trying to, the internet was coming of age, trying to make sure the rules of the road were clear. We made a big investment in things like trying to kind of bridge the digital divide through the Case Foundation and partnerships with Microsoft and Gateway and a lot of others. We built over 1,000 technology centers in schools and churches and boys and girls clubs to give people who didn't have a computer at home, didn't have the internet at home, and were really being left out when their teacher was assigning things that kind of presumed, they access to a PC, access to internet. You had to give people that kind of access. So I think this is always going to be part of running a company that has a broad impact in society, and entrepreneurs, as they get more successful, need to understand that success has many benefits, but it also has many responsibilities.
And I think we have been soliciting questions from audience members that folks backstage have been moderating. So let's turn to some of those while we still have time. Question number 1 from Tim Borchers. What should college students learn so that they can be innovative and entrepreneurial?
Well, I think it's true with college. It's also maybe more true with K-12, which is we need to make sure we are encouraging people to think out of the box. That is, in essence, is what entrepreneurship is, just imagining new possibilities. And I think most people, when they start, like in kindergarten, are pretty creative and think out of the box. And then after they get educated, we're going to kind of train them to stay in the box and sort of almost paint by numbers. And some of that creativity, some of that sense of wonder and possibility, kind of gets lost. So I think it's not just what happens in the classroom, it's how do you build things around that. So there is more of this kind of jazz kind of creative process, and people are asking the questions about how can this be kind of different, how could this be better, and bringing that entrepreneurial mindset to whatever they choose to do. So there are things that in different schools now, much more than were true before, that are clubs and different ways to connect with mentorship and other things with different entrepreneurs in the community. That is a good way to do it. The Startup Weekend organization does over 1,000 different Startup Weekend events. That's a good way to get exposed to entrepreneurship if it's something that you haven't really done before. There are a lot of different organizations that are now focused on entrepreneurial education, if you will, but it starts with just this notion of thinking out of the box.
All right, next question from Sarah Grant. In the first wave, you had to convince people of the internet's value. What kind of similar challenges do you see in the third wave?
I think the third wave is going to be more complicated. As I said, the notion of partnerships in government is going to be, you're going to have to build more alliances. You can't, as I said, go it alone. And it's also going to be more of enterprise sale, using a kind of business term, because if you want to kind of figure out a way to revolutionize classroom learning, for example, you are going to have to sell to and partner with schools. And so it's not just dropping an app in the App Store and saying, okay, healthcare is solved, or education is solved. It's going to be a constructive engagement with incumbents, where there's a lot of power of the learning in the cloud, but there are also a lot of people right now on campuses and all over the world, and figuring out ways to take their learning experience and make it more active and more personalized and more engaged is actually the best way to revolutionize education. But you're going to have the partnerships. I think people will understand the power of the idea, but getting from here to there will be more complicated, and it's not going to be people kind of just doing it on their own. It's going to be people putting together these tapestry of alliances to take these ideas and bring them to life.
All right, the next question. If you could go back, what would you have done differently at AOL?
I think in the go-go years, I mean, just for context, when we started in 1995, 1985, my days wrong. Yes, 1985, 30 years ago, we had like 25 people. A decade later, we had like 200 people. And a decade later, we had like 10,000 people. The first decade, even though it was really hard and frustrating, and as I mentioned, we had all kinds of challenges, including Apple deciding they didn't like us anymore. That actually was in some ways easier to manage because the pace of that growth was more moderate. That second decade, when it really were hiring people so fast, I think in retrospect, although we needed the people because we were growing fast, we probably should have been a little bit more careful on culture issues and make sure that we weren't just attracting people that kind of were free agent mercenaries because this was the next big thing and they thought they could make money, and try to make sure that people really were passionate about the idea and kind of you really believed in the mission. And so in retrospect, we as we were in those go-go years and hiring so many people, I think we should have been just a little bit more disciplined, maybe hired a little bit more slowly, to make sure people didn't just have the skills, but also had the passion.
I thought for sure your answer was going to be something to do with the Time Warner merger. No?
No, not really. For me, the Time Warner merger is a mixed bag because AOL grew rapidly in the 1990s. When we went public in 1992, the company was worth $70 million. 8 years later, when we did the Time Warner merger, it was worth $150 billion. It was the best performing stock of the decade. And it was going to be hard to sustain. And so basically what we did was we traded 100% ownership of a business that had $5 billion of revenue and $1 billion of profit, or a 55% ownership of a business that had $40 billion in revenue and $10 billion of profit. It kind of built a kind of a foundation, which has borne out well for the AOL shareholders. Now, as part of that, I stepped down as CEO. I regret that. I'd like to think if I stayed, maybe things would have been better. You never know. But I think it was the right thing to do in terms of my principal responsibility then as the as the CEO. So I'm frustrated about it, and the fact that AOL was such an important part of, at one point, over half of all internet traffic in the United States went through AOL. In fact, and it was the leader in terms of communication services, and a lot of things that happened since, whether it be Twitter or Facebook, obviously, a lot of that, the ingredients of that were in AOL. So of course I'm frustrated by it, but I also look at it in a broader context, and just given those dynamics and given what happened after the merger, where half of the companies that went public went bankrupt and companies like Priceline lost 99% of its value, it was the right thing to do strategically, even though it ended up being a difficult thing emotionally.
All right, so we have 1 minute left, so quickly, last question. What is the most important thing community members can do to build their startup community in a small city like Buffalo, New York?
Collaborate. It's all about network density. And what I found traveling around these different cities, and each of them, as I said, are a little bit different, is the real breakthrough is when you can figure out ways to create this network within each community. You've got to engage the large companies, the Fortune 500 companies, to pay attention to what's happening in startups and incent them to be part of that startup community. It's helpful to engage government. You know, it's more complicated. They can be champions. They can deal with some of the issues around regulation. They can be a magnet for capital or a magnet for talent. It's important to engage the universities if you have one in your particular community. There is a lot of great ideas there. There's too many ideas generated in those labs that don't get into the marketplace, and creating more paths to entrepreneurship there is important. And you particularly have to engage the entrepreneurs and have them, of course they need to focus on their startups, and that in itself is a big job, but they also need to be part of rebuilding or strengthening the startup community. So everybody has to come together in a collaborative, networked fashion to really lift up these communities, and if they're successful in doing that, it will allow more boats to rise.
All right, well, thank you so much, all of you, for joining us, and thank you especially to Steve Case.
And we have one last thing to run as you leave. We are running a short video of the Rise the Rest tour, and hope to see some of you in some of the cities I mentioned in May in the South. So run the tape. Thank you for coming out this morning. Appreciate it. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
And we're sourcing the ladies that will come to our academy in 2 avenues. First of all, through other companies that would like to take our program and have us train their ladies, or through the Ministry of Labor and the Human Resources Development Fund. We'll be working with ladies that then don't have jobs. And what we would do is work with almost like preferred vendors and do on-the-job training, where they've got 2 days in our academy and 3 days on the job.